I'm Sarah, and this is Budget Sew, where we create stylish, fashionable looks as inexpensively as possible. Today is December 17th, and the 17th day of Vlogmas. Vlogmas is a holiday event where YouTube creators, such as myself, post a video every day in December leading up to Christmas. Today, we're doing a sew-along to McCALL'S 2811, View C, because what's Christmas without a Christmas apron? I bought McCALL'S 2811 for $2.99 at Value Village thrift store. You may remember this pattern from my sewing haul video. Start the car! The link to that video is right here at the top of the screen. In that video, I bought an armload of sewing patterns and sewing supplies for a fantastically low price. It was as if someone cleaned out part of their sewing room and donated it to my sewing stash. I was thrilled. McCALL'S 2811 was published in 2000 and is part of their retro collection from the 1950s. There are 5 apron variations included in this pattern. Apron A has a back wrap, and Aprons B through E have a back tie closure. Aprons B, D, and E have contrast variations. I chose to make View C, but with 2 fabrics, so it has a View E feel, but uses less fabric. The suggested fabrics are cotton and cotton blends, chambray, broadcloth, gingham, and lightweight denim. The first fabric that I chose was given to me by my mom. She thought it would be perfect for a Christmas apron. She bought it from Len's Mill store during a huge fabric sale. Len's Mill, a huge factory outlet that sells fabrics, craft supplies, housewares, and so much more, had a massive sale to clear out some of their inventory. Their entire selection of previously reduced fabrics was 75% off the lowest ticketed price. And if you finished the bolt, then it was 85% off. This lovely fabric was included. It was previously reduced to $5.49 a meter, and there were 2.2 meters left on the bolt. That means that prior to the sale, she would have paid $12.08 for this fabric. But since she bought the last of the bolt during the sale, she got 85% off the total price, so she paid $1.81. The link to the video of my Len's Mill fabric haul is right here at the top of the screen. The second fabric I chose was a gorgeous red satin. This is one of the scraps of fabric that I received from FabCycle. They collect fabric scraps from Vancouver apparel manufacturers and have production offcuts, swatches, and other wonderful textures and colors of fabrics. The scraps are free, but you have to pay shipping or pick up the scraps from their Vancouver-based reuse center. The scraps come in various sizes. Some are as small as 2 centimeters, and some are much larger and could come in uneven cuts. They don't guarantee which scrap sizes you'll receive, but for every scrap box they make, they add a good mix of sizes and textures so you have a lovely selection of materials. The link to the video of my FabCycle fabric haul, including this red satin scrap, is right here at the top of the screen. Apron C had 6 pattern pieces. It used pieces 9 through 13. There was a tie, strap, bib, skirt back, skirt front, and waistband. My first step was to lay out my pattern pieces onto fabric. Instead of using one color for the skirt of the apron, I chose 2, red and green. Perfect colors for Christmas. I folded pieces 12 skirt back and 13 skirt front in half along the fold line for View E and placed the bottom half of the skirt pattern onto my red satin fabric. I didn't use piece 17 lower skirt for View E because it was longer since this piece was gathered and then sewn onto the skirt front and back. I had just enough fabric for the lower half of the skirt, front and back, plus seam allowances. Since I used the lower half of the skirt pattern from pieces 12 and 13, I had to add seam allowances to the red satin so that the skirt was as long as view C. Then I laid out the remaining pattern pieces, the tie, strap, bib, upper skirt front, upper skirt back, and the waistband onto my green fabric. I didn't add any extra seam allowance onto the green skirt pieces. Instead, I added it all to the red satin pieces. When I cut out my pattern pieces, I always cut the notches outward onto my fabric. It's a habit that I developed when I was learning to sew with 1970s simplicity patterns. They had big blue numbered notches that stuck out from the pattern pieces, and their instructions were to cut the notches outward. This differed from my McCALL'S sewing guide for vintage 1950s McCALL'S 5136, where it said, "Cut in notches not more than half the width of the seam allowance. For fabrics that ravel easily, cut notches outside of seam allowance while cutting out garment." I was surprised to see that this pattern advised to cut the notches outward too. It doesn't really matter which way you cut the notches, just that you do so you can line them up later. The waistband pattern piece required interfacing. The pattern's instructions said based interfacing to wrong side of waistband, but I used fusible interfacing instead. Then I folded each tie in half lengthwise with the right sides together and matched the notches. These will be stitched at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, leaving the end nearer to the notch free. Then I folded each strap in half lengthwise with the right sides together. These will be stitched at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, leaving the slanted end free. Since my skirt is a bit different from the pattern, my instructions differ slightly from the pattern's instructions. The pattern recommended finishing the edges of the skirt pieces before pinning them together, but I pinned my skirt pieces together first. I started with the green or upper half of the skirt and pinned the backs to the front with the right sides together. Then I pinned the red satin or lower half of the skirt backs to the front with the right sides together. At my sewing machine, I stitched the lower half skirt backs to the skirt front. Since I sewed red satin to red satin, I used red thread for these seams. I bought my thread for 49 cents from Fabricland online. Since this thread was such a great price, I ordered 4 spools of red thread, 2 of purple, 2 off-white, 2 light blue, 2 brown, and 4 beige. The link to my last Fabricland online fabric haul is at the top of the screen. Then I switched my thread to green to sew the upper half skirt backs to the skirt front. I used Gutermann color 794 Spectra Green to sew these seams. I didn't buy this thread for this project. I had it left over from another sewing project, Vogue 2476. Years ago, I started sewing the jacket of Vogue 2476, but never finished it. I think I may have another go at that pattern because it's so pretty. Then I sewed each of the ties in half lengthwise, taking a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, leaving the end nearer the notch free. Then I sewed each of the straps in half lengthwise, taking a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, leaving the slanted end free. I cut the corners diagonally on both the straps and the ties. Then I turned them right side out and pressed them. I pressed everything as I sewed as recommended by Simplicity in their Simplicity Sewing Book from 1975. Then I pinned the upper half of the skirt to the lower half of the skirt. Next I pinned the straps to the outside of the bib, having the fold of the strap at the circle on the bib, the seams of the strap toward the side, and the raw edges even. Then I pinned the other bib, or the bib facing to the bib, right sides together, leaving the lower edge free. At the sewing machine, I basted the straps to the bib. I tried a new technique for sewing. Well, new for me. I found this tip in the Simplicity Sewing Book from 1975. It said, "Stitch as much as you can each time you are at the sewing machine without breaking the stitching. As you finish one seam, feed another garment under the presser foot and continue stitching." This procedure is ideal for stay stitching and finishing seams. It also saves hand motions as well as thread. I'm not sure if I'm going to stick with this technique. I feel that I have to remember to clip all the threads later, but I do like that it saves thread. This is a really good idea when you're playing bobbin chicken. Then I sewed the upper skirt to the lower skirt, right sides together. I used my Spectra green thread to sew this seam, even though I was sewing red fabric to green fabric. If I had used piece 17 for the lower half of the skirt, the red satin would have had to have been gathered before sewing it to the green upper half of the skirt. Then I sewed the bib facing to the bib, right sides together, leaving the lower edge free. I made sure to keep the opposite ends of the straps away from the seams so that they didn't get caught in the seam allowance. The Simplicity Sewing Book had other great time-saving techniques. It said, "It goes without saying that you stitch as much as possible by machine rather than by hand. Having complete command of your machine and taking advantage of all its features will improve your stitching efficiency." I love this book. It's so handy. Then I cut the bib's corners diagonally. I turned it right side out and pressed it. My next step was to baste the raw edge together. Then, to finish the back edges of the skirt back, I pinned a narrow 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeter hem. I folded over the edge and folded it over again, completely enclosing the raw edge. Once that was completed, I intended to gather the upper edge of the skirt with machine basted stitches. At the sewing machine, I stitched the narrow hem on the edges of the skirt back. I switched my thread to red to sew the red satin. I stopped sewing where the green fabric joined the red. I used a Schmetz universal needle size 75 or 11 to sew this apron. I used the same needle size that I used for my last sewing project, my 2-color plaid and navy blue infinity scarf. The link to that video is in the description box below. Before I continue with the sew along, please like and share this video with your friends and family. I would love to help others sew and refashion on a budget and troubleshoot their favorite patterns. I also love sharing the treasure that I find at thrift shops. If you'd like to see more from BudgetSew, please subscribe and make sure that the bell is on so you receive a notification when I release a new video. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BudgetSew. Now back to the sew along. At the sewing machine, I continued to stitch the narrow hem on the edges of the skirt back. I switched my thread to Spectra Green to sew the green fabric. I stopped sewing where the red fabric joined the green. It may seem like a bit of a chore switching back and forth between the thread colors, but I think that this gave it a great look. Then I adjusted the stitch length on my sewing machine to the longest stitch possible and basted the upper edge of the skirt at 5/8 and 1/2 inch or 1.5 and 1.3 centimeters from the raw edge. This step was done so that the skirt could be gathered before it was attached to the waistband. You can see that I pressed open all my seams on my skirt. It made sewing so much easier, and it even looked better as I sewed. Then I basted the lower edges or the raw edges of the bib together. I'm all about pressing in this project. Next, I pressed under 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters on the long, unnotched edge of the waistband. Then I started to gather the skirt. The instructions recommended pinning the waistband to the skirt, matching the squares to the side seams and the circles to the back edges, and then adjusting the gathers to fit, but I started gathering first. This saved me from being poked with pins as I gathered. The Simplicity Sewing Book had a great tip for gathering. Before stitching on the seam line as indicated in the pattern, loosen the upper or needle thread tension slightly so that the bobbin thread will pull easily as you adjust the fullness. Once the skirt was gathered to the right length, I matched the squares on the waistband to the side seams of the skirt and the circles to the back edges and adjusted the gathers again. My next step was to hem the skirt. The instructions said, finish the lower edge of the skirt with a 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeter narrow hem. Instead of folding over the fabric twice and then pinning it, I pressed the hem. I folded over the hem once, pressed it, then folded it over again, and then pressed it again. The raw edge will be completely enclosed once this is sewn. This saved on pinning time. Then, with the right sides together, I sewed the waistband to the skirt, ensuring that the squares and side seams lined up, as well as the circles and the back edges. I also adjusted the gathers for the best fit. Another tip from the Simplicity Sewing Book about gathering was, use a slightly longer than average stitch length for sheer fabrics and use the longest stitch for heavier fabrics. I used the longest stitch on my machine for the green fabric. Then I switched my thread back to red to sew the hem. I really like this technique of pressing the hem before sewing it. I used a straight stitch for this hem to match the hem on the side seams of the skirt back. The Simplicity Sewing Book had a handy cutting tip that I already use. When pattern pieces are to be cut on the straight of grain, place straight edges of the waistband, cuff, or garment center back along the selvage to eliminate seam finishes. clip the selvage every few inches to prevent puckering when the garment is washed. Then I pin the facing of the bib to the wrong side of the skirt, matching the center fronts, notches, and having the raw edges even. Next, I pin the tie to the waistband, right sides together, having the fold at the fold line, the seam downward, and the raw edges even. At the sewing machine, I sewed the ties to the waistband. I switched back to my Spectra green Gutermann thread, since I was sewing the green parts of the apron. Then I stitched the bib to the skirt. The instructions said, pin facing side of bib to the wrong side of the skirt, matching the center fronts, notches, and having the raw edges even. Baste, stitch entire waist edge. I sewed the gathered skirt to the waistband and then the bib to the waistband. I didn't baste and then stitch the entire waist edge. Then I folded the waistband on the fold line with the right sides together and pinned the ends. I actually used a sewing clip for this. I only have 4 of them, but I think they're great. Then I removed the sewing clip and sewed the ends. I bought these sewing or fabric clips in an Artica sewing kit from Amazon.ca. The link to my review of this sewing kit is in the description box of this video. My next step was to finish the waistband. The instructions said, slip stitch, pressed under edge of waistband, over seam. To slip stitch, slide the needle through the folded edge and pick up a thread of underneath fabric. Instead of slip stitching this by hand, I pinned it in place and chose to machine stitch it down. I liked this step because it completely enclosed the raw edges, even the raw edge of the bib. Lately, when I've been cooking and cleaning, I've been wearing an apron to protect my clothes. But I wanted another one so that when that one is being washed, I have another one to wear. At the sewing machine, I stitched the pressed under edge of the waistband over the seam. The Simplicity Sewing Book had a chapter all about pressing, from start to finish. It said, learn early on in the game that stitching and pressing go together. Pressing a garment both during and after construction is what give it a finished appearance. It separates the well-made garments from the homemade ones. Many fabrics have, as their outstanding characteristics, the texture they receive from various manufacturing and finishing processes. Proper pressing methods will retain these textures. Then I pressed the bib upward and pinned it to the upper edge of the waistband. Then I lapped the upper edge of the waistband to the lap line on the strap, having the long edge of the strap even with the back edge of the waistband. Then I pinned it in place. The pattern provided extra length for adjustment. At the sewing machine, I edge stitched the ties and the edges of the waistband. I started at one end and sewed my way across the front of the apron to the other end of the tie and back again. I checked the other side of the ties to ensure that the thread tension was set correctly. I didn't want any loopy threads. As I edge stitched, I secured the shoulder straps in place. The pattern recommended to try on the apron before sewing the straps to the upper waistband, just to make sure that they were the right length. As I edge stitched, I secured the bib in place. I'm definitely going to sew this apron pattern again. I think I may try a different apron next time. I'm leaning towards Aprons A or B. I like view A because of its full coverage with the overlapping back and deep pockets. I think that would be really good for painting. Apron B is very pretty with the contrast panels and rickrack. I also like the inseam pockets. Here is the finished apron. To complete the look, I'm wearing a navy blue and green chaps dress that I bought from the Hudson's Bay Company and then lengthened it using additional fabric that I bought from Fabricland. The link to the video where I show you how I lengthened this dress is right here at the top of the screen. I bought the 9 West shoes a few years ago for a New Year's Eve party. The necklace came from the Salvation Army charity store, and my earrings and brooch were in a Ziploc bag full of jewelry that I bought for $5 at a church Christmas bazaar. I hope you enjoyed my sew along to McCALL'S 2811. Please like and share this video with your friends and family. I love sharing my new, vintage, and out-of-print sewing patterns, and my tips, tricks, quick fixes, and even my mistakes when sewing along with you. I also love sharing my wonderful fabric finds that I thrifted from charity shops, as well as brand new fabric online and in-store. If you'd like to see more from BudgetSew, please subscribe and press the bell so you receive a notification when I release a new video. If you'd like to stay up to date with BudgetSew, follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BudgetSew. Thanks for watching. See you next time.